another moment for everyone to join before we get started. Can someone just confirm in the chat box that they can hear me okay and see the screen? Okay, great. Thank you so much. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started as we have a lot to cover today. Okay, so good morning, good afternoon. My name is Britt Parker, and I'm with the National Integrated Drought Information System, or NIDIS, in Boulder, Colorado. Welcome to this post letter of intent informational session on the Climate Program Office FY25 Coping with Drought competition on understanding and assessing drought in a changing climate. I serve as the program officer for this competition. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be available on the Climate Program Office FY25 Funding Opportunity and Drought.gov web pages, along with frequently asked questions generated through the Q&A portion of this webinar. And we will update this FAQ periodically if more questions come in that would be beneficial to everyone. Before I begin, I just want to give a brief overview of what we'll be discussing today. There's a lot to go over, and I want to give you ample time for questions, but we'll start by just going over the FY25 Coping with Drought competition requirements, the review process for the LOIs, kind of look at what the LOIs by the numbers in terms of how many, the funding request, etc. Then we'll dig in on some general feedback on the LOIs. I'll give you an opportunity to ask questions then. Then I'll spend a few minutes at the end with an overview of the full proposal and some just key things to remember as you're putting together your full proposal if you chose to do so. And then we'll have just at the end any further questions. So before we really dive in, I just want to say thank you to all of you who took time to develop your ideas and submit an LOI. We saw some really great innovative ideas, and we really appreciate the time and energy that you put into this. And I also want to just set some expectations. We want to use the time in this webinar to really clarify feedback and dig deeper into generally what feedback we provided to help inform your next steps. But what I can't do today is answer really specific questions about your LOI or project idea. So if after today you still have questions about the feedback you received specific to your project, you're welcome to schedule a 15-minute meeting with me during the period from October 28th to November 5th. The link to do this was in your response letter, and I'll also be putting that link in the chat box. And so I am going to try, I'm on my own today here, so I'm going to try to drop a bunch of links in the chat box here. And then I'll do that again at the end, just for anyone who joined late. So bear with me for 1 minute as I change tacks here. Let's see. And I see, you can see me doing all this, which is just wonderful. But here's all the links I'll be referring to. They're now in the chat box. And so I'm going to go back to, oh, I hope I didn't shut it. Sorry, bear with me again. Okay. Thank you for your patience. Okay, here we go. Sorry, I think I shut that instead of minimized it. Okay, so all the links are in the chat. We'll do that again at the end for anyone who joined late. So over the last several years, concerns have been raised about the intensity, duration, and frequency of droughts in a changing climate. and moving into the future. So this poses new challenges for drought assessment. Current methods for assessing drought conditions do not consistently and deliberately consider drought in the context of climate change, thereby perhaps unintentionally promoting drought response strategies that may be limited in building long-term resilience in a changing climate. So in November of 2023, the NOAA Climate Program Office and NIDIS released the Assessing Drought in a Changing Climate Technical Memorandum based on a technical workshop co-hosted by NIDIS and the U.S. Department of Agriculture Climate Hubs. The technical memorandum is the result of input from more than 100 subject matter experts who during the meeting identified priority actions and outstanding research questions aimed to address this issue. So a portion of the technical memorandum is the focus of the FY25 NIDIS Coping with Drought grant competition. As a reminder, the competition is focused on improving drought indicator performance to account for non-stationarity with the goal of more accurate drought assessments that support communities in preparing for, mitigating, and responding to drought. And we did include some exemplar research questions. You were not limited to these questions, but they were things like how well do current drought indices depict drought conditions and are they effective given regional differences in non-stationarity? How can existing or new drought indicators or indices be utilized or adapted to improve assessment and predictability in a changing climate? How do drought indices better reflect how the intensity of an event affects drought conditions, such in the case of high intensity precipitation events? Are there conditions when current drought indices no longer accurately represent drought on the ground? And if so, how can these times be objectively identified? So these are just, and I didn't read all of them, I don't want to take the time, but we just wanted to stress that proposals may address one or more of these and or other related research questions focused on the topic area, but proposals are not expected to, nor should they address all of them. So that's just to remind us what the focus of the competition is. And for the purposes of this competition, we provided two definitions. The first is that we are defining non-stationarity as the status of a time series whose statistical properties, mean, variance, et cetera, are changing through time. And for the purposes of this funding opportunity, we're considering non-stationarity due to both anthropogenic climate change and or natural processes. And we're defining a drought indicator as a physical manifestation of drought within the climate system, while an index is a statistical representation of those indicators. So now I'll go over the guidelines of the competition, many of which are the basis for the LOI review, along with fit to the topical focus of the competition. So these can be found in the competition information sheet. And successful proposals will, meaning they must, clearly demonstrate collaboration and partnership to include decision makers from relevant sectors and communities across all levels of government. These partners should be part of an integrated project team that will contribute subject matter expertise and or who are beneficiaries of the results of the proposed research to ensure the results are assimilated, utilized, and enhanced drought assessment, planning, early warning, response, and mitigation within the NIDIS drought early warning systems after the completion of the project. And this may also include representatives from public and private sectors, academia, local, regional, tribal, and federal government entities, non-governmental organizations, environmental groups, citizen groups, etc. So as appropriate to your project, these are the types of partners that we would like to see that you engage with. So proposals will also demonstrate relevance to NIDIS national and regional priorities and clearly state how outcomes contribute to the needs articulated in the Assessing Drought in a Changing Climate Technical Memorandum, especially those focused on improving drought indicator performance. They will demonstrate support of diversity, equity, and inclusion and environmental justice in their proposals, not only through the required statement, but their project teams and engagement in partners where appropriate through the proposed work. And we've asked that you include travel to an all-PI meeting, which we will work with successful applicants to schedule in conjunction with a major scientific conference near the end of the grant performance period. And I'll talk a little bit more about that during the Q&A portion. So proposals may, meaning they're encouraged to demonstrate work that completes or complements, or builds upon other funding sources, and demonstrate external contributions in kind or funding to be leveraged with these federal research dollars, though to be very clear, there are no match or cost share requirements for this competition. There are also some additional considerations that are important that are covered in the information sheet. Research that provides concrete application to drought assessment, planning, and decision-making will be given preference. Applicants are encouraged to be aware and consider integration of research results into our regional drought early warning systems. And then the other thing is that these project funds will be awarded as cooperative agreements, thus ensuring a working partnership and substantial interaction between the project PIs and the NIDIS program, NOAA scientists, and other relevant staff. So let's jump to the review process. So the LOIs were reviewed based on relevance to this funding announcement, its focus and requirements. So each LOI was reviewed by at least 3 people well-versed in the purpose and scope of the funding announcement. If you received feedback, that means 1 or more of the reviewers thought your LOI was potentially deficient in 1 or more of areas identified in the announcement. And so please remember, this was not a review of the quality of the proposed idea. Rather, this review focused on the fit or the scope of the idea relative to the funding announcement. And we also want to acknowledge that within a 2-page LOI, not all information about the project will be fully articulated. That is the role of the full application. And so, it's possible that your thoughts are more aligned with the competition, but what we've provided in terms of feedback is based strictly on what was in that LOI. So based on the reviews, each LOI received one of the following 4 recommendations: strongly encouraged, encouraged with modifications, discouraged without modifications, or strongly discouraged. So strongly encouraged meant that your LOI substantively responded to all required elements as described in the funding announcement. Encouraged with modification means your LOI responded to the required elements as described in the funding announcement, but in order to be competitive at the full application stage, some attention will need to be given to strengthen the response to certain requirements. If you receive discouraged without modifications, that means your LOI did not substantively respond to some of the required elements as described in the funding announcement. And reviewers felt that your LOI would not be competitive at the full application stage without some significant changes. And finally, strongly discouraged means your LOI was not relevant or did not substantially respond to the required elements as described in the funding announcement. And we do not think that the LOI would be competitive at the full application stage as it stands. The intent of this review, again, is on relevance and fit. So there were some really good ideas that came in that we felt were just outside of the scope of this competition. And we're trying to be really respectful of your time, your partner's time, and the time of our technical experts who will serve on panels to review the final proposals, and really be honest about the relevance to the specific competition and its focus. So before we dig into the feedback, I want to give you a sense of the level of competition this year. Our total funds anticipated for this competition are $2 million per year for a total of $4 million, and we anticipate being able to award approximately 8 projects with funding of up to $500,000 each over the 2-year cooperative agreement. So we received 81 letters of intent. We outright discouraged 23 of those. We discouraged without modifications 27, and we encouraged with modifications 18, and then 13 were strongly encouraged, meaning reviewers felt that they really hit the mark in terms of fit. The 81 LOIs totaled a funding request of just under $36 million. So when we compare that to the $4 million total we anticipate to be available over the 2 years, I think we can agree that the competition for this grant will be stiff, and we really encourage you to take the feedback on your LOI to heart before proceeding to full proposal development. I've also broken down the total requested by each of the feedback categories just to give you a sense of the magnitude of the request under each. So before we dive into the feedback, I really want to distill into 3 questions what we feel is most important as you prep or consider prepping your full proposal. Ensuring that you're clear on these 3 questions in your full proposal will result in a more competitive proposal. The first question is, which drought indicator or indices are being targeted, and how will they be improved in the face of a changing climate? The second is, who are the beneficiaries of this work, and how can they be engaged through the life cycle of the project? And the third is, how will outcomes be disseminated such that they can be incorporated into an improved drought assessment? And as this is an applied research program, the letters of intent that rank well are those that strongly address the requirement for stakeholder and partner engagement and the applicability of results to drought assessment. So let's dive into each of the individual categories of feedback and some of the specific information we provided based on what level of feedback you got. So if you received a recommendation of strongly encouraged, then reviewers felt that your LOI substantively responded to all required elements as described in the funding announcement, and you likely did not get much more than that from us. There was really no comment because, again, we felt that the LOI really hit the mark. So now I'll go over the feedback for each of the other recommendations. If you received a recommendation of encourage with modifications, as I said, this means your LOI responded to all the required elements as described, but there was a feeling that some of these elements may need to be strengthened in the full proposal to compete well. And so this recommendation received 1 or maybe 2 of the following sets of feedback. And on these kind of high level topics, you're going to see the repeat in the next level of recommendation with a little stronger language. But the first was around stakeholder and partnership engagement. We felt that further clarification was needed in the full proposal on the process for collaboration and partnership with decision makers who would use project outcomes in drought assessment and engaging them through the life cycle of the project. And we just said that engagement with diverse stakeholders from multiple sectors where appropriate is encouraged. In terms of connection to drought indicator performance, the feedback was that further clarification may be needed in the full proposal on how the work will directly improve drought indicator performance, that the work seemed relevant to the competition, but this key linkage was not always as clear as we would like to see. And then the last was on dissemination of outcomes and needing further clarification on how project outcomes would be disseminated such that they would be concretely applied to drought assessment. If you received the recommendation of discourage without modification, this means that reviewers felt your LOI did not substantively respond to some of the required elements as described in the funding announcement. With this recommendation, normally you also received 1 or 2 pieces of the following feedback. So again, the first one is stakeholder and partnership engagement. And we just reiterated that this grant is being supplied by an applied research program, and therefore proposals are required to indicate how the research will be applied, who will apply, and what decisions it will inform. And those LOIs that got this feedback lack sufficient plan and process for collaboration and partnership with decision makers. And ultimately, we felt that if this level of recommendation was given and it was based on this aspect and requirement, that it really wasn't even mentioned in the proposal. Then there was drought indicator performance in a changing climate, and the feedback there was, while there is mention of improved drought indicators, it's not clear what these are or how they will be represented to the user community in such a way they can be utilized in assessment. Or where there is mention of improved drought indicators, there's really no mention of historical or projected climate, so that non-stationarity aspect of it. Dissemination of outcomes, this really, again, came down to the need for this information to be concretely applied to improving drought indicator performance and drought assessment. And clarification would be needed in the full proposal on what information and outcome would be produced and how that information would be delivered in usable format to end users. And finally, there was a subset of LOIs where we acknowledged future drought, in that the LOI proposed work that was really focused on understanding future drought. And while this is incredibly important, the direct improvement of drought indicators for application, to present drought condition assessment and understanding current conditions in a changing climate was not clear. Finally, for those, and I think I said this, but I just want to reiterate that given that we are an applied research program, we took a pretty hard line on stakeholder and partner engagement. So even if your proposal addressed the competition topic, if you did not mention stakeholder engagement and who would use the work, and there was just no indication of, kind of thinking through that with needing more time to further develop that, then we did discourage without modifications. Finally, if you got feedback that was strongly discouraged, there were really two places that this happened. One was that the LOI and the proposed project proposed important work that addresses a portion of the Assessing Drought in a Changing Climate technical memo, but it was not clear that it addressed the specific topic of this competition, which is to improve drought indicator performance in a changing climate. The other bit of feedback that you might have gotten was that while this project proposes very important work, it does not address the specific topic of this competition, again, which is to improve drought indicator performance in a changing climate. So again, I'll come back to these key questions that we really want you to keep in mind as you develop a full proposal, and that is, which drought indicators and indices are being targeted and how will they be improved in the face of a changing climate? Who are the beneficiaries and how can they be engaged through the life cycle of the project? And then how will outcomes be disseminated such that they can be incorporated and improve drought assessment? So at this point, I want to take a few minutes to answer any questions you have about the application process or feedback that was provided along with the recommendations. And I'm going to remind you that after we're done with this Q&A session, I'm going to take a few minutes to remind you of how to schedule time with me to discuss your LOI, highlight some really important process considerations as you prepare your full proposal, and just point out a couple areas where applicants have had some challenges in the past, just to have you keep those in mind as you pull together your full application. So I'm going to invite you to go ahead and start entering questions into the question box. But while you're doing that, I want to start with a series of questions that came in via email that are applicable to everyone. So I'm just going to go ahead and work through those, and then I will turn to the question box and take your questions. So question one was, can we allocate funds in the budget for stakeholder engagement for things like workshops, surveys, etc.? The answer is yes, absolutely. As you've likely gathered, this is a very important component of the projects, and allocating a portion of the budget to this activity is completely acceptable. The second question was, is it preferred to have one letter of support from a boundary entity that can assist with stakeholder engagement, or multiple letters from individual stakeholders from multiple sectors? So we want to be respectful of the time it takes both you and those writing letters of support, given that they are not a requirement. That said, what I've seen in panel review, I would say perhaps the letter from the centralized collaborator, that boundary entity, would be great. And then you might choose one or two individual stakeholders who will be particularly involved and demonstrate clear need and intent to use the outcomes of your work. And that kind of combination will likely serve you very well. But do not feel you need to ask for a letter of support from every potential partner or stakeholder. The next question was, what do I do about the required DEIJ statement if my state institution has laws or policy against such activities? So what I would like to do is encourage anyone who is in this situation to take advantage of the office hours and sign up for a 15-minute appointment with me so that we can discuss the nuances of your situation. And again, there's a link to the office hours in the chat box. I'll put that in again at the end of the Q&A period, and it's also in your response letter. So I encourage you to take advantage of that. The next question was, when you talk about engaging stakeholders and partners, does this refer to specifically to individuals such as water managers on the ground, or it can also include other NOAA affiliated scientists that we've collaborated with? So when we're talking about stakeholders and partners, we're talking about the end users of the information that your project will produce. So those, and we want that engagement early and often, you know, so this information can be co-produced to ensure it's useful and usable in drought assessment. So your partners can include scientists from federal agencies, from NOAA, but again, we really want to, and I don't like the term end user, but we really want to focus on the end users of your information. And, you know, depending on your project, if it's sector focused, then of course they would be from a specific sector. You know, we just want you to really think through who's going to be using this information. And we also recognize that you know, for instance, we had a number of proposals from like state climate offices, and a lot of times you will also be the user of the information you produce. So we do recognize that, but we just want kind of a holistic consideration of the partner and stakeholder engagement. A few more questions that we already had. The proposals are to include travel to an all PI meeting. Could you clarify if this refers to a meeting attended only by the lead PI or all PIs involved? Do you know where it will be, how long it will take, and how should we allocate funds? So for the last couple grant cohorts, we've done 2 all PI meetings, one at the beginning and one at the end of the grants. These have been very well received, but they've been virtual, and we had feedback that it would be great to do the final all PI meeting in person. So we'll work with the grant cohort on the exact timing and location, but I know you need to generate a budget. So for now, please use Boulder, Colorado, where NIDIS is headquartered, and 3 days to create a budget. We would love for the lead PI to attend at the minimum. Whether time or travel is budgeted for co-PIs or early career scientists and postdocs to attend can be determined by your overall project budget. You know, other scientific meetings you'd like to attend and present the work, etc. So we're not opposed to more than one person attending, but we will want to see kind of balance in the budget. The next question was, can you clarify the difference between a co-applicant and a sub-awardee? So there are 2 ways you can submit a project with multiple institutions. The primary applicant can apply and include subawards to other institutions. So let's say there's one primary institution with 2 subawards to 2 different institutions. Or all 3 partners in the first example could each put in a separate application for their portion of the project and budget, and this is referred to co-applicant. So if the latter is the case, then there is guidance as to what parts of those applications should match and which should be different. Note that there should still be a primary applicant who includes a holistic budget for the whole project in their application. And if you're going this route of co-application, I would definitely encourage you to take advantage of the office hours so we can just talk through everything and make sure those applications come in correctly. Final question before I go to the Q&A box. What is the official competition name we should use on the title page? You can use something as simple as FY25 NIDIS Coping with Drought, Understanding and Assessing Drought in a Changing Climate. So that's fine. Okay, so I'm going to go to the Q&A box at this point. How ready the proposed drought indicators for used by stakeholders need to be? Okay, I think there's a couple typos in that one, no problem. So I think the question is, and please correct me in the chat box or in the Q&A box if I'm wrong, but at the end of the project, how ready do the drought indicators need to be for stakeholder use? So for this competition, they should be ready for stakeholder use. And one of the things, again, that will be important to explore is how those will be disseminated such that they are available to be incorporated into drought assessment. The next question is it better to include multiple sectors or a single sector for stakeholder engagement? So that will be completely dependent on the project you're proposing. You know, we've got some projects who are very focused on one sector, and so it would not make sense for them to kind of arbitrarily bring in other sectors where it doesn't make sense. So that if you're working with an indicator indice that's broadly applicable and you would like to and can bring in multiple sectors, that's great, but that's really going to be determined by the project that you propose. The next question are there specific types of stakeholders that are prioritized? Federal versus state government versus nonprofit versus private sector? What about types of decisions? Is state level monitoring, i.e. like a state climatologist, considered competitive, or do you prefer prioritize more on the ground decisions such as from water managers? So, and in general, what defines a decision? Okay, so there's a lot there. So we are not prioritizing any specific type of stakeholder. So again, I think it's really going to be driven by the scope of your project, geographical focus of your project, sectorial focus. So there's no, you know, one stakeholder that trumps another in terms of review. It's just really about, have you considered what it is you're trying to do, how it will be applied post-project. We also aren't prioritizing types of decisions. And in general, I think, you know, how do we define a decision? So again, I think that's going to be really specific to the type of indicator or indice you're trying to improve, the kind of information you're providing. It could go into, you know, a state drought assessment or drought assessment for a specific location or community or sector. It could be that, you know, it's informing decisions that a water manager or resource manager would make. But we just want to see that you've kind of thought through how the outcomes of your project would be applied. And, you know, again, please feel free to use those office hours if you want to dig in just a little bit more. One of the stated goals is for the improved drought indice to be used in drought monitoring. So how do we interface with the drought early warning systems and the U.S. drought monitor to integrate the improved indicators into these monitoring efforts? So in terms of the drought early warning systems, you know, once the projects are awarded, you will certainly be working, depending on the geography of the project, with the drought early warning system coordinators at NIDIS. And so you can tap into, you know, their expertise and their familiarity with the partnerships there, and you can indicate that desire to work with coordinators as part of your application, because they cannot be part of the application process. So that would occur after it is awarded. In terms of the U.S. Drought Monitor, I think there's, you know, multiple levels that you could ensure that your improved indicators are informing these efforts. So there's certainly at the tribal and state level, you know, most states have a process by which they're assessing drought and providing feedback to the U.S. Drought Monitor. There's, you know, Drought Monitor authors themselves, but ultimately, the U.S. Drought Monitor usually sees itself as a kind of consumer of information. And so if there are improved indicators out there, you know, they would integrate those and start looking at those. So I don't think you necessarily need to go kind of to the source. It's really going to be, perhaps at that state level or tribal level, or again, community or sector level if there's a sector community that's assessing drought and making decisions based on that information. And in terms of how to interface with those, we've talked about like the dues coordinators with NIDIS and that happening after the fact, but this is a place where it's, I think, important to start developing some of those relationships, and there can be one or two key relationships with end users. I mean, you don't, this takes time, and relationships take time. So we don't necessarily expect there to be like a long, a super long list of partners you're engaging with, but we do want to see that, some key engagement. Can you give an example of successful stakeholder engagement? Yes, let me think. Like in terms of what we've seen in research projects in the past, sometimes they've set up a small advisory group where they're engaging with, let's say, a state drought task force or drought monitoring committee, and they're engaging with that kind of advisory group they've put together throughout the project, where they're kind of going back and forth with, here's our ideas. More importantly, I think starting with what decisions are being made and what information is needed to improve those decisions. And then here's our ideas for, a product or a indicator that could improve that decision. How does that sound? And just a lot of back and forth with how the information will be delivered, what the information looks like. But like setting up small advisory groups have been one way we've seen that work well. Is there a preferred mode to disseminate new information discovered through the project, a new methodology or advanced knowledge? Preferred, no. Obviously scientific publication is great. It gets it out in the peer-reviewed literature. But in terms of disseminating like an improved drought indicator for those successful projects, like we can certainly brainstorm the best way of getting that information out there. But there's websites, there's informing and partnering with those entities that tend to provide drought indicators to the public. There's drought.gov, depending on the outcome, where we can work with you to perhaps share information. We've had projects that have created websites, dashboards to share information depending on the target audience. So there's not really a preferred mode. We just want to ensure that you're thinking about dissemination, and that you have some thoughts and ideas on not only maybe an initial website, but longevity and continuity for delivering the information. And then like I said, we're happy to work with successful applicants through the life cycle of the project to ensure that's happening. Is it okay to focus on a specific region versus national? Yes, is the bottom line. That is fine. By drought indicator, I assume you mean drought index, because drought indicators as physical variables need more fundamental improvements in their measurement itself, as opposed to indices created with non-stationarity incorporated. Yes, that is true, but we also have had projects that kind of look at the indicators themselves, how those are changing, and how we might extract information that is better informing drought assessment in that regard. So generally, yes, I think that's true. But there's also some work that can be done on better understanding the indicators and how we're using those. I don't see any other questions in the Q&A box at this time. I'm going to give it another minute, and then I'll move on with the last couple slides, and then come back to the Q&A box in case that there's additional questions. Okay, so not seeing more come in. Let me go to the next slide. So I am offering office hours. As I've said, if you still have questions about the feedback or other questions on the process for applying. The link is one that I've put in the chat box, and I'll put it in again at the end of the presentation. So please do take advantage of this time. The appointments span the time frame from October 28th to November 5th, and so please make every effort to schedule during this time. But if for some reason you're gone, traveling the entire time, etc., please reach out to me via email and we'll find a different time to meet. I highly encourage everyone who plans to apply to take advantage of these times, but specifically if you're a federal applicant, if you're considering co-application with multiple institutions, or as I mentioned in the Q&A, if you have potential issues complying with the requirement of a DEIJ statement, then please do schedule time and let's talk through those special conditions. So full applications are due at 11:59 p.m. Eastern on December 9th, 2024. Please make sure that you read fully the funding opportunity as well as the information sheet, as failure to comply with the provisions of the NOFO will result in the application being returned without review. So just a quick reminder about the review and selection process. Upon receipt of full applications, an administrative review for completeness and compliance with requirements will be completed. Those that pass will proceed to an independent panel technical review for 3 criteria: technical and scientific merit, overall qualifications of the applicant, and project cost. Each reviewer will provide 1 score for each criterion from 1 to 5. Those scores will be considered using the weighting averages in the NOFO to produce a single numerical score for this step. Project scoring at least 3 out of 5 will proceed to an independent panel review for importance, relevance, and applicability to program goals, where each reviewer will provide a relevance score from 1 to 5. To determine the final score, the scores from the technical review will be combined with the relevance review with a weighting of 60 and 40% respectively. And then we will look at, the rank order of the applications. So before we wrap up, I can't stress enough how important it is this year that applicants begin the submission process of your full application well in advance of the December 9, 2024 deadline. We always stress that you should not wait to the last minute. And every time we have a fully scoped project that gets turned away because of challenges with the submission. So this is especially true this year. We're working with a new grant management system at NOAA. Institutions must have and maintain 3 separate registrations to apply: SAM.gov, grants.gov, and ERA Commons. The complete registration process for all 3 systems can take 4 to 6 weeks. The application process will require that applications go through 2 levels of checks, the first in grants.gov and the second in ERA Commons. If there are errors in the with ERA Commons, you must resolve these and resubmit through grants.gov and go through this process as many times as it takes to have the application cleared by both grants.gov and ERA Commons. If your application does not clear checks in ERA Commons, NOAA will not receive the full application. So please leave enough time to go through the registration and application process. There is guidance that we're providing from NOAA Fisheries on registration and the 2-check process and resolution of common errors. That's one of the links I put in the chat. It's also on the web pages. So submit early. And if you have questions as to whether your application was received, please email me directly and do not wait till the last minute. Finally, a reminder of where you can find the information you need to apply. Again, I'll put these links in the chat box, but please read the full Notice of Federal Funding Opportunity and the Coping with Drought information sheet to ensure you understand fully the focus and requirements of your proposal for your proposal. One thing I want to point out is the instructions on page 11 of the NOFO on the federal form SF424A. NOAA asks that for a budget broken out by year, which is different from the instructions on the form, which asks for a budget broken down by task and activity. So I just want to flag that. Please also note that all budget numbers throughout the application need to match and be rounded to the nearest whole dollar. So please use the cheat sheet we provided to make sure all components are included in your application. And please follow that application guidance from NOAA Fisheries when working to access the system and troubleshoot the process. We're also providing this year guidance from our Grants Management Division on developing a strong budget narrative. So that information is also on the website, but I'll provide that link in the chat box momentarily. So a recording of this presentation and a FAQ based on your questions will be available on the Climate Program Office Funding Opportunities website, as well as drought.gov, and we'll update that FAQ if additional questions come in. Please use the office hour times I'm holding as opportunities for additional questions, and also feel free to reach out to me at any point in the process if you have especially application questions come up. So before we end the webinar, I'll look to the Q&A box to see if there's any final questions. Let's see. Is there a specific budget template we need to use? So yes, when you go to grants.gov, well, when you go to the funding opportunity to the NOFO and to grants.gov, there are templates for the SF 424, 424A, and other federal forms. So those should all be available through grants.gov. And then it would definitely behoove everyone to look at that guidance on budget narratives, because that also provides some template information on how to put together your budget narrative. So yes, there are templates that you will need to use. And if you have trouble locating those, please let me know. When will the recording be available? It will take us a couple days, but certainly by the beginning of next week, it will be available. Will the applications be submitted in grants.gov or ERA Commons? It's actually a combination of both. It will go into grants.gov and then be pulled into ERA Commons. That guidance from NOAA Fisheries should really lay out that process very clearly, as well as, kind of the checks it goes through at each of those points, and what kind of errors you might get and how to resolve those. So my understanding is that you will start with grants.gov, but please read carefully that instruction from the Fisheries Service, and if you have any questions, please reach out. Yes, since there's a mismatch in the instructions regarding the budget, you mentioned which should be followed. So you should follow the instructions in the Notice of Federal Funding. So that is the 22-page document that lays out, all the requirements for the application. And that information is on page 11 under number 11, federal budget forms. So it's, we want the budget broken down by year. And by budget category versus by task. So it's the by year, which we want, versus the by task. And if you have any questions, please reach out. Which document takes precedence, the NOFO or the SF 424A instructions? The NOFO instructions take precedence. And let me just reassure you that what I'm trying to do is cut back on back and forth in the long run. So if you break down your budget by task on the SF 424A, that is not like your application will not be kicked out, like it will be reviewed. But these are some challenges that I see every year, so we're just trying to take care of them up front. So follow the NOFO instructions for the SF 424A. Again, circle back to me if you have questions. Do all funded partners have to be signed up, have an account in grants.gov and ERA Commons? So it depends. If you are submitting a primary application and have subawards, then you and your institution are responsible for submitting the application and then disseminating the funds through subawards. If you are doing the co-applicant situation where, let's say you have 3 funded partner institutions and each one of those institutions is putting in an application, then yes, all 3 of those institutions need to be registered in all 3 of those systems. And so, you know, I understand that subawards can cost more sometimes. They can be, you know, more workload on the primary institution, but we've already seen where there's a challenge with the co-applicant process, where one of 3 co-applicants doesn't get their application in time. And then it's really hard to review, right, an incomplete project, which what we end up having on our plates. And so, you know, both work for us, but I think with the new system and some of the challenges we're seeing in application, that having 1 application come in and not 3 is to your benefit. But of course you can choose either route, and we'll do what we can to support you, you know, whether you are a primary application with subawards or you are a co-applicant with multiple applications coming in. So hopefully I've answered all the questions, and you're welcome. So I'm going to give it another minute or 2 just to make sure we don't have any last minute questions. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to share all of those links one more time for anyone who came a little bit late. So give me 1 second, and please take this time to ask any last minute questions. Okay, so I'm dropping into the chat all of the links again. I'm going to go back to the questions. Okay, I don't see anything else coming in. Use those office hours. You have my email. Reach out to me at any time if you run into challenges with the system or if you have additional questions. I really want to thank you all for taking the time to join the webinar and to get more information. And again, thank you for the time and energy you put into the LOIs. And if you're choosing to submit a full proposal, we wish you the very best through the competition process. And I'm not seeing anything else come in. So with that, I'll say thank you for your time and attention this morning or this afternoon. And we're looking forward to those full applications. We're really excited by some of the ideas we've seen thus far. So thank you, best of luck, and hopefully I'll speak to many of you soon in the next week or so. Take care.